Good morning, everyone. And we certainly extend a good morning to those who will be joining us momentarily. But we're delighted to have such a wonderful audience today, and of course, three extraordinary panelists. My name is Kevin Burns. I'm the mayor of Geneva, Illinois, and the chairman of the Metropolitan Mayor's Caucus Environment Committee and Energy Subcommittee. And today's discussion is regarding the enacting of policies that support clean energy, implementing clean energy policies through code policies. Energy codes, as all of us know, and policies are critical tools that help municipalities reduce energy use by providing benefits to property owners over the long life of the building. Since we last met to discuss this topic, which was March of 2021, there have been two significant changes that amplify the importance of these tools. The first is we completed our climate action plan for the Chicago region, otherwise known as CAP, with a specific objective to implement clean energy policies. As we all know, the regional greenhouse gas inventory showed that more than 2/3 of our emissions, 69% in total, come from building energy use and power generation. 26% of emissions come from just residential use only. Innovative new building codes and policies will reduce those emissions over the long term. And second, the landmark climate and energy legislation passed this fall, the Climate and Equitable Jobs Act, or CEJA, sets aggressive new clean energy goals and creates opportunities for advancing clean building energy policies. Our Greenest Region Collaborative has been involved in trying to strengthen building energy codes these past couple of years. And thank you to those municipal officials that have spoken up for and voted for better energy codes. And those officials include not just elected officials, ladies and gentlemen, but our frontline partners who are carrying out the policies and the duties of the community every day. The code development and adoption process is complex and, of course, always evolving. And of course, I had the pleasure of being involved in a code discussion about a year and a half or so ago. And if any of you have ever been in a room full of code enforcement officials, building professionals, and climate activists, it is a sight to behold. But regarding policies, we're hoping to make some significant advancements as we have, and we hope to continue pushing that ball up the hill, as it were. Cheryl, I'm going to turn it over to you to provide some housekeeping issues regarding today's presentation. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Mayor Burns. Yes, so if you would rename yourself so that everyone knows the organizations that you're with, you can just click on the three dots by your picture, choose rename, and add your organization after that if you haven't done so already. Also, the meeting's being recorded and it will be posted on the Environment Committee webpage and the Metropolitan Mayor's Caucus YouTube page a day or two after the meeting. Thanks.
Thank you, Cheryl. And by all means, use the chat room, folks. If you have any questions at all, Cheryl and Edith and I will be monitoring that as we go along. So we'll be happy to provide you with the best answers we can. We have some extraordinary partners with us today who are representing organizations to help navigate the process and amplify the municipal voice in code enforcement and development, adoption and enforcement. They are also helping us identify new opportunities to stretch codes to achieve even more and shape policies to achieve our Greenest Region Compact and now Climate Action Plan objectives. So if you'll permit me, ladies and gentlemen, to introduce our panelists. Allison Lindberg, Senior Building Policy Manager, Midwest Energy Efficiency Alliance, otherwise known as MEA. Allison is the Senior Building Policy Manager at MEA. Her work includes improving energy efficiency in buildings spanning over, ready for this, 13 states in the Midwest. And I believe, Allison, if I'm correct, or you call Aurora home. Diana Burke, Project Manager, New Buildings Institute, NBI. Diana has been involved in energy policy and sustainability work for over 14 years. As project manager on the codes and policy teams at NBI, Diana helps advance policies to encourage net zero energy and carbon neutral buildings in cities and states across the United States. And our final panelists, Jeanette Lazaks, Interim Director of Research and Innovation at Slipstream. Jeanette is the director of Slipstream's Research and Innovation Group. She has over 15 years of experience in developing and managing energy research and planning projects. So ladies, the floor is yours. We look forward to your presentations and the organic discussions that will result. So with that, we look forward to your comments.
All right, I will start us off. Hi, everybody. This is Jeanette Lazaks from Slipstream. Everybody should see our title presentation. Mayor Burns, thank you for that great introduction and context for the next hour and a half of hopefully really good discussion.
Absolutely.
So we'll start off with a little bit more, partner our introductions of our organizations. We're going to dive into building energy policies and why they matter, and background on kind of the mechanisms that drive building energy policies, and then focusing on kind of what you could do.
I'm sorry to interrupt. I'm not seeing the slides personally.
Oh,
Is anybody else struggling with that?
Yeah, I don't see them either.
interesting. Okay, I'll stop sharing and then share again. How's that? And maybe that'll help.
Give that a shot.
All right, how does that look?
Now it's on.
That worked.
Oh,
Thank you.
good. I am sorry, not sure what happened there.
Oh, it's all good. Thank you.
Oopsies. Oh, there we go. Okay, perfect. Okay, so what I wanted to mention just in terms of this agenda, and Mayor Burns kind of teed us up, is that we hope to have, we're going to have a lot of poll questions throughout, not to quiz you, but to really get your feedback and hear from you. I know that there are quite a number of people on the call today, and we thought that poll questions would help generate conversation and give us the feedback that we're hoping to hear throughout this presentation. Feel free to use the chat and also, I guess, unmute yourself if you have any questions. I'll start off just by giving a quick intro. We'll start off by giving quick intros of our organization. Slipstream is a nonprofit with a mission to accelerate climate solutions for everyone. And we do that through providing research, program implementation, financing, and technical assistance and education and training. We are working in the code space right now in a number of ways. We have implemented a number of code baseline studies, code compliance studies for Minnesota and in the Illinois area, or in the Chicagoland region. We are working with Mia, Allison will introduce herself in a second, on exploring how utilities might be able to expand energy codes work in Illinois. And that's what's driving a lot of the conversation that we're hoping to get out today. So with that, I will pass this over to Allison.
Great. Thank you, Jeanette. And thank you, Metropolitan Mayor's Caucus, for having us here today. As Kevin Burns, or Mayor Burns, said, I'm Allison Lindbergh with the Midwest Energy Efficiency Alliance, and we are a nonprofit organization, and we work to promote energy efficiency through policies and programs. As he mentioned, we cover a 13-state region of the Midwest. We are a regional energy efficiency organization, of which there are 6 across the United States. So we represent your area. And we're also a membership organization with over 160 members. So we're a kind of a collaborative network, and that's how we inform some of the research that we do, is by taking the pulse of different people in the energy efficiency industry. And that does include state and local governments. So we have some of those represented as our members, also electric and gas utilities, research and academic institutions, and then, like I said, people that are in the energy efficiency industry. And as Mayor Burns mentioned, yes, I am a resident of Aurora, Illinois, where I currently am at this moment. So nice to be here. And I think we pass it off to Diana now.
Great, thanks, Allison. As Mayor Burns said, I'm Diana Burke. I'm a project manager at New Buildings Institute, or NBI. If you're not familiar with NBI, we're a mission-driven nonprofit based in Portland, Oregon. We push for better buildings that achieve zero energy and zero carbon. Next slide, please. Thanks. So if you are able to attend the Environment Committee meeting in March, you probably heard me talk about the 5 foundations of zero carbon building policies. I'm bringing these up now because they're important to keep in mind if your community is interested in advocating or adopting building energy policies, like state stretch code that can help meet your community's climate goals. The sweep involves efficiency first, the most cost-effective way to get to zero carbon emissions. On top of efficiency, we advocate for policies that address on-site renewable energy, so our buildings can run on clean, cheap electricity from the sun. As we start powering more of our buildings from renewables, we have to start thinking about how to better time our buildings' energy consumption at the time of day those renewables are producing electricity. We can do that through the 3rd foundation, grid integration techniques and energy storage. And then we also have to stop burning fossil fuels like natural gas in our buildings and start running them on the clean renewable electricity. And then the 5th foundation, we have to start considering the life cycle impacts of our buildings like embodied carbon. Next slide, please. Fortunately, the Clean Equitable Jobs Act, or CEJA, addressed most of these foundations in the bill. First, the state is required to create and allow municipalities to adopt an efficient stretch code for residential and commercial buildings. Allison will talk about this in more detail later on. The legislation also begins to transition Illinois from 11% renewable energy today to 40% renewable energy by 2030 in 9 short years, with the goal of having 100% zero emissions power sector by 2045. Experts predict that because of the incentives in the bill, over 1/3 of renewables built in the state will be rooftop or community solar. CEJA also addresses the 2nd foundation, grid integration and energy storage, by stimulating $4.6 billion in investment in energy storage, which is expected to result in 1.4 megawatts of storage installed in Illinois over 10 years, so that building owners and utilities can store that renewable energy and use it later when the sun isn't shining or the wind isn't as strong. Finally, CEJA also begins to address the 4th foundation, electrification, by offering rebates for electric vehicles and electric vehicle charging infrastructure, which will likely result in 1 out of every 5 cars in Illinois, or 1 million vehicles, transitioning from gas to electric. CEJA also expands utility efficiency programs and allows utilities to offer rebates for building electrification. And now I'm going to pass it to Edith so she can talk about the related climate action plan for the Chicago region.
Sure, and just briefly, as Kevin said in the introduction, the Climate Action Plan really validated some of our early efforts in looking at building codes. And what we were able to do when we prepared the Climate Action Plan was quantify from greenhouse gas emissions and look at using the modeling tools that we had, is really understand the role of the policies and the codes that we're talking about today in reducing our emissions. And I put this little snip of the mitigation appendix that shows not only implement clean energy policies as one of our objectives, but there are 4 objectives here specifically related to the conversation today. And if you'll take a quick look at the 4 columns to the right of the strategy, the role, what's our role in doing all of these things, the solution status, that's where we're at. These are all evolving, with the exception of the one proven one for codes and policies related to renewable energy, with potentially high greenhouse gas reduction potential, or enabling, meaning it's the first step, and relatively low cost. So we're very interested. This dovetails with the regional planning effort we just completed.
So thank you for that context. I think that background leads us nicely into our first poll question, which is really here just to set the stage for the remainder of our conversation, which will dive into a lot of details related to energy policies, largely around kind of codes, building energy codes. What we want to get out of this question is really to think about what policies you've considered for your municipality. I know everybody here is at a different stage. So I think the poll just popped up, and I know we started this poll slide knowing that we haven't gone through any of the policies themselves to give you background. So some of them you may not be familiar with, and that's okay. But we are just trying to understand kind of where people are at in thinking about these policies. We'll pause for a second as people are responding. It looks like we're getting a lot of responses. So thank you.
I don't see it as a poll. I see it as just the slide.
Okay, so on the bottom of your screen, there should be like a poll. It should pop up if you press it.
Thank
If
you.
it doesn't automatically pop up, you can get to the polls that way.
And if I can just add a little poll direction, if you see that gray bar to the right of your rectangle, scroll down so you can get to the second question. And you may be in charge of your own view of the poll dialog box. So after, if I manipulate it and it doesn't go away, you'll want to minimize it on your screen after we're done discussing it.
Yeah, so the two, so we put both of the questions. One was, which of the following building policies have you considered? And then if you answered yes to the previous question, what are the driving forces for them? In a lot of our research and work in this area, we probably can guess the responses, but at the same time, it's useful to hear people's feedback. If there's anything else you want to add, feel free to write it in the chat. It looks like we have about 29 people that responded. I think that probably is good enough to maybe close it.
All right, you seeing the results now?
Yep.
Yeah, do folks see the results? So it looks like, you know, a lot of people, looks like 70%, it's really driving the EV policies, solar ready policies are a lot of the policies that folks have been considering for their municipality. A little less on the stretch codes, a little less, even less on benchmarking and building performance standards. And we'll get into a couple more details around that in a little bit. And right, so Sylvia from the city of Darien mentioned that, you know, Soul Smart, clearly through the Soul Smart initiative, that's probably driving a lot of that higher percentage. You know, what's interesting is that the reasons for people, driving forces for considering them, you know, residents expressed interest, city staff wanted to pursue the policies, less so business community wanting to do any of the policies. So, and then there's others. I don't see many others in the chat, but feel free to continue and add your comments if you want to elaborate, or we could, if you want to, I'll pause to unmute if anyone wants to just jump in and say anything around that. And if not, I think we're okay. Well, thanks for participating in the first poll. Like I said, there's going to be a few more coming up, but we'll continue on and start by talking about, you know, narrowing our focus to building energy codes and the policies around the building energy codes and why they really matter. And I'll pass it along to Allison to provide a little more context.
Yes, thank you. So I do know that some of you had participated in the International Code Council, the ICC Energy Code development process. And I'm sure that some of you know also that that process has changed a little bit. I'm not going to talk that much about that today, but if you are interested in learning more about where that process is going, hit me up later and I can let you know. But what I will say is that energy codes are extremely important as part of this solution when we're looking at climate change. I like to think of it, and I'm totally stealing this from ACEEE, the American Center for an Energy Efficient Economy, that they're like peanut butter and jelly. You've got like the conservation policies like energy codes, and then you have like the solar and the renewables. The sandwich doesn't taste good unless you have both of them together. And I think that it's just extremely important to understand that the conservation measures that are going to make our buildings use less energy actually make it so that we don't need as much solar and we don't need as much of these other things. Or if we still do the same amount of those other things, which I keep saying other things. Diana is going to get into that in more detail. Then we, maybe we're going beyond what we actually need, and that we don't need to hit every single building. And as everybody probably knows, because I'm sure you've seen it on many slides, buildings constitute about 40% of our energy consumption in the United States. So it's extremely important that we are looking at how to make them use less energy. So one of the ways that we can do that, and actually the most cost-effective way to make buildings use less energy, is to get them in new construction and to get them through energy codes. And basically, energy codes are a set of rules, mainly for new construction, but also some different levels of rehabs and renovations and additions that set the minimum for efficiency targets. I like to think of this as the bare minimum worst building that can be built in terms of energy efficiency. That's what the energy code says. The model codes are developed every 3 years on a 3-year cycle. And then depending on where you live, the municipality may adopt the code. Now in Illinois, all municipalities are supposed to adopt the state energy code. The state energy code process is actually happening right now in terms of creating what's going to end up being the new code for Illinois. You can go to the next slide. And the codes are supposed to get better in terms of energy efficiency every code cycle. And this shows the trajectory of the model codes as they've been developed on that cycle. So in case you didn't know, I find this kind of interesting. We didn't really have energy codes in buildings until the 1980s. And even so, we still have some states that don't have energy codes at all, even though they're supposed to. So the next iteration of the code is the 2021 IECC, or also the ASHRAE standard 90.1 2019. And they are getting better in terms of efficiency, but there is a missed opportunity in the sense of not every state adopts them in their entirety, and they actually will do weakening amendments. And that's currently what is actually happening in Illinois right now. If you follow the energy code adoption process, you'll see that they're trying to weaken the 2021 IECC for the entire state to make it less energy efficient. And I'll just say this: if you're interested in getting if you're interested in participating in this process, let me know. But what we're going to talk about today instead is this opportunity for municipalities to go beyond what is actually the state energy code. And that's what is called this stretch code. So you can go into the next slide. And so the municipal role for getting involved in this is, yes, you can influence the development at the ICC. It's now a standards development process. We're learning as we go along. Both Diana and I and Slipstream are part of this development process. And if you're interested in getting involved, like I said, hit me up. Hit up one of us and we'll let you know how you can get involved in this. But right now, that process it's probably not the best place for a municipality to get involved, but there will be opportunities later. There's still a couple more years of that development process happening. But what could happen instead is you can help with influencing state amendment and adoption in the Illinois Energy Conservation Code. There are code amendments that are being discussed as we speak. And then there's also an advisory committee, which they're looking for some new members, and we'll talk about that. And then the biggest thing that I think we're interested in talking about today is this new stretch code that will become available. So adopting this stretch code, which has the energy conservation measures in it, will be really key. And then also enforcing the codes and compliance with code. And so I'll go into the next slide about complying with the code, because that's a big piece of this. There you go, Jeanette.
Sure. Yeah. And actually, I just wanted to pause because Anita from Winnetka mentioned that the other problem is many municipalities do not know the codes well enough and therefore do not enforce them. So this is actually really is a perfect dovetail into what we're talking about here in terms of compliance challenges. There's what you just mentioned, Anita, is lack of education and awareness potentially of codes or specific code language. There's a number, I don't have to read these all through, but, the highlights are resources to dedicate to enforcement, resources to provide trainings to staff. You know, there is a learning curve with every 3 years that Allison mentioned in terms of updates. That means new information that needs to be learned and applied and enforced. And so that learning curve is not necessarily trivial, and need to be addressed, right? There's also kind of external forces, retiring workforce, so retiring building code officials. There's a sentiment that there's no market demand for efficiency. This is in quotes because we don't see that necessarily from our end, but that is sometimes a perception. And then of course the code complexity as there are more and more code elements that are increasing efficiency, that could drive some complexity that is hard to enforce. So all of these challenges are things that we've seen in our work. And actually, just to pause before the poll, I do want to mention that there are, so Vikas, I don't know how to necessarily, Vikas, if I'm pronouncing your name correctly, but you mentioned our codes being applied for high-rise buildings in downtown Chicago. Several of these are over 50 years old. I want to pause on that question and hold that thought till we talk about building performance standards, because the codes are really focusing, we're talking about right now, on new construction. So with this one, you know, I'm kind of curious to hear from this group, what are the issues that you see? This is basically a rehashing of the list that I previously showed in the previous slide, but this is another poll that we want to hear from you in terms of what are the pain points that you see in terms of compliance, because the codes can only get us so far. But if they're not being complied with, then we are losing savings that could be implemented in those buildings. And as Allison said, the new construction is the prime opportunity to get those savings kind of captured in the building. And so complying with codes are important. So I'll pause.
And if anyone has not, if that does not automatically pop up, be sure to click on the poll button at the bottom of your screen, and you should have the current poll question.
Just and I'm noting Anita had another comment. Every municipality should have one point of contact that has the knowledge of the energy code and its applicability. And then this group would be able to network for help and suggestions. It's a great idea.
I'm wondering how many people on the call are building code staff members who would have more knowledge of this.
Right. I think that that's a very important thing to mention. And I also think that it's really important to understand that if you are not that person that has the knowledge about that, these issues are still very important in terms of getting these policies passed. So I think that we also just wanted to take the pulse on, you know, do you know what these issues are? And if you don't, that's completely fine. But we're just trying to understand, how can we help educate you better?
Yeah. Thanks, Allison. And it looks like everybody should be able to see the responses. We got about 30 responses. So driving this, the top two, lack of education and awareness around codes and challenges in staff resources to dedicate to enforcement. Those are overwhelmingly, selected. Of course, this select all that apply, and you could see all the issues kind of maybe waterfalling down from there. It looks like nobody doesn't see any issue. So it seems like there are things that we have heard, and it's reflected kind of in what this audience is seeing as well. This is great. Thank you. Craig just adding from the comments is willingness of municipalities to support new and potentially averse technology and methods. And then Mayor Burns, elected officials must announce clear and compelling support for building code officials that are responsible for educating and enforcing code. Those are great comments. Anything else anybody want to add? Else we will move on. Great. So, we mentioned stretch codes a little bit. Allison teed us up for that. Essentially stretch codes gives municipalities a mechanism to take action on their buildings energy use and climate change goals, using an alternative and mandatory compliance path that promotes energy efficiency beyond the existing available options. This can result in cost savings for residents and businesses. And then overall, it helps, move the market towards the adoption of more energy efficient codes in the future. As Allison mentioned and showed in that nice graph, it's a constant, update of codes. And with each code cycle update, there is an increase in efficiency. Stretch codes kind of takes the next level and prepares the market so that it's ready to move beyond the existing baseline code, because the existing baseline code is just the floor. Buildings can be more efficient, and stretch codes are one way of making that more efficient.
Jeanette, could I chime in with a
Yeah,
question?
go ahead.
And forgive me for not knowing the answer myself, but a couple of my colleagues in the elected side of the world and a couple of my friends in the development side of the world have asked me point blank, can a municipality that is not home rule in Illinois adopt stretch codes that are stronger than the Illinois code?
So in Illinois, for commercial, you can adopt codes that are more stringent than the commercial code. And are you talking about Illinois or were you talking about elsewhere?
I'm talking about Illinois, irrespective
Okay.
of the size of your community. Is that
right? I think the only limit right now, and this is changing with the CEJA legislation, but the only limit right now is in residential, where you can't exceed the existing code for residential buildings. But in commercial buildings, you can.
Okay.
We could talk about this in a little more detail, but Allison unmuted for a second. But the only thing I would like to add is that, with the legislation, CEJA legislation that we'll talk about in more detail, it provides a standard stretch code. Right. So one code that would be applied throughout the states. Right. And so whereas, a municipality could take on a stretch code right now, it may be different from municipality to municipality.
Exactly. Illinois being so unique in the non-home rule, home rule bifurcation of the world. Mm-hmm. That's where the challenge, I think, comes in.
Yeah, and it's hard for the market to react to.
Sure.
There's like lots of different codes to build to, basically.
Okay. Craig's commenting as well on the chat, so that's great.
Yes.
Those Naperville folks are awesome.
So Allison, was there anything else you wanted to add?
I just wanted to add, I guess, just quickly that this is changing, but I don't know when it's going to change. That's been a little bit nebulous in terms of the CEJA language, is that if you look at it from the time that CEJA was enforced and enacted, then this is already happening, which means that you can only have the state base code or the stretch code, except for the home rule or the over 1 million in population. If you look at it instead from when the stretch code will go into effect, that won't happen until like 2024. So there's actually a meeting today that will put some of this into perspective, but I just wanted to put that out there because I don't want to give the wrong impression that this still might be available. I just don't know.
Yeah, and actually,
go ahead.
Go ahead. Sorry, I was gonna just move us along because I know that in 4 slides we're gonna actually discuss CEJA in more detail and maybe answer some of the questions that are coming up about CEJA. And Allison, you will be talking about that in more detail. So I will quickly fly by this because this is basically how one might approach stretch code development. and adoption, and just to say that we're going to be focusing on these two processes right now as it relates to CEJA, in that legislatively mandated process or through a normal adoption process, and then which was developed in a stakeholder process. So we'll talk about the nuances of all of that in the next slides, and then hopefully answer some of the questions that are coming up.
Great. So yes, there's been some questions about clarifying things of what CEJA has changed. So what CEJA is changing and specifically is doing related to the stretch code is it's directing the Capital Development Board, who is the entity that currently manages the state energy code adoption process, to create a residential and commercial stretch code that can be adopted by individual municipalities. So how I would turn on my video, but I am having some internet lag issues, so apologies. So the stretch code can be adopted by individual municipalities, and this changes it. Before, on the residential side, a municipality could not adopt anything that was above the state energy code. They could do it for commercial. What this is going to do, though, on the commercial side is that it's going to create, as Jeanette mentioned, a more standardized commercial stretch energy code, which is going to be better for the entire state all around, because it's going to provide a consistent stretch energy code. So instead of different municipalities having different codes, now all the code officials are going to know that this is what the stretch code is. All the builders are going to understand this is what the stretch code is. So the Capital Development Board has to create this, and then individual municipalities have to adopt it. Okay, and can you go back one slide? Apologies. Thank you. So what the stretch code actually says is it just creates an efficiency target for both the residential and commercial stretch code. And so it has not yet, we do not actually know yet what the different measures that might be in the stretch code, but we do know how efficient it has to be. It will be up to the Capital Development Board to create the stretch code itself. And just as a point of conversation, the first target will be about 9.1% more efficient than the current Illinois energy code for commercial. It will be about 23% more efficient for residential, and that's in the first cycle. And the reason that it's such a big jump for residential is because Illinois keeps weakening the IECC every code adoption cycle. And so that's why it's really important to have this option for a stretch code, because even though, yes, we have a state energy code, it keeps getting weakened. And so this will actually provide a step to keep the municipalities that adopt it to keep moving forward in terms of energy efficiency. It's basically a guarantee that buildings are going to continue to get more efficient. And then once this is formally adopted by a municipality, it basically takes the place of the state base energy code. You can go ahead to the next slide. It also allows for a compliance path for certain third-party recognized entities such as Passive House. So if you build Passive House, you'll know, hey, yes, this meets stretch code. And then the biggest thing, at least in terms of like what we're here to talk about today, is that it allows utilities to engage in code compliance related education and programming. So utilities can now create programs that would support a stretch code. And also base code as well. And then I just wanted to make this point: Chicago will still be able to adopt its own stretch code, as well as some of the home rule entities. You go on to the next slide. And then these are what the residential targets are. So it makes a site energy index goal for each code adoption cycle. So over 3 years, it'll be updated. And then on the residential side, it will end up being 75 more efficient than the 2006 version of the International Energy Conservation Code. And then that's where it will stop. And then go on to the next one. And then for commercial, it will end up being a little over 60% more efficient than the 2006 IECC. And so as you can see, it steps up every 3 years, and it's just getting more energy efficient. And again, this is really exciting because it will allow not only municipalities, but people in the design community and the building community to know where the code is going. Right now, we don't know that. We don't know what's going to end up happening in the Illinois code, but with the stretch code, we're going to know. And so that's like a very nice way for people to be able to plan on what's upcoming, and also for support mechanisms to be put in place in terms of education and training. And, we need to know what's coming up. You can go on to the next slide. And then just some next steps. So the Capital Development Board must meet by mid-November to outline what are going to be the next steps to actually develop the stretch code. And at 1 p.m. today, they are actually having a meeting, and it's public, to talk about what they're actually going to do in this process. So we're literally learning this in real time about what the next steps are going to be. The Capital Development Board at a minimum must have the code completed by the end of July of 2023, with final language available for adoption by the end of 2023. So again, there's opportunities for utilities to assist here. And then the fact that the stretch code is now available, it will make it easier for municipalities to adopt. And so Slipstream and MIA, this is part of what we're doing. We're doing outreach to let you know that this is available. We'll also be doing outreach to let you know what kind of support mechanisms are available coming forward. So go on to the next slide. And then, so the state energy code process for the base code is happening right now. And there's a little bit of influence from CEJA on this state process. And one of them is that there is something that's called the Illinois Energy Conservation Advisory Committee, and it has a number of representatives that are already mandated by statute. And CEJA actually adds 5 new members to that committee. So this isn't just for the stretch code, this is for all of the state development process. And it includes all of the representatives you see here. Writing is that environmental justice and environmental advocacy and energy efficiency is going to be more well represented on this advisory committee. And then I just want to add that some of the proposed amendments that are being considered for the state base code are being rejected because the entities that are on this committee are saying, oh no, we'll consider that in the stretch code instead. So it's having a little bit of influence on the state process, but I'll also say historically, it's been unlikely for Illinois to strengthen the code stronger than what is the model code. They usually weaken it. So I don't know that has a huge influence on what might end up in the state-based code, but it's just something new that is being discussed. And go ahead to the next slide. Great. I also just want to mention, so there's a question. The slide shows that the code is coming in 2023. Does it not be available till 2024? So if the stretch code is developed on the timeline as stated right now, then yes. The Capital Development Board could also decide, let's do this faster if they wanted to. So I'm not sure that that's what they'll do, but if they did, then it would become available for adoption before that. So I guess we'll learn more today. And I think Diana is next.
Yeah,
correct?
And I just wanted to pause. There's one question from John Michelotti about how do stretch codes help the 90% of buildings that are already in existence relative to all the climate deadlines? And I think that's a great question. And just want to re-emphasize that stretch codes won't really be, unless they're rehabbing or doing major renovation on a building, they won't be affecting existing buildings. So it's really just we're really just talking about new construction or major renovation. And that's a very good point, but we are going to be talking about later in this presentation, and I will admit that we don't have a lot of emphasis on it because codes are so kind of front and center right now in terms of what's happening in the state. But we are, another policy mechanism is benchmarking and building performance standards, which does address those existing buildings and the energy performance of those existing buildings. So we'll talk a little bit about that later today, and this is like a couple comments that mention this, so I know that there's a kind of appetite to talk about existing buildings. So just kind of hold tight on that, but we understand, just want to re-emphasize that stretch codes are really about new construction, but it will move the market as new construction continues to be built. So and then Cheryl just included the WebEx link for today's meeting, which I think anybody can join and listen in. So I'll pause just for if there's any other questions on what we presented so far before passing it to Diana. All right. Okay, I'll pass it along to Diana.
Thanks, Jeanette. So I'm going to be talking about potential amendments to Illinois state stretch code in my presentation. But before I go into possible energy code amendments, let me first explain the code amendment process as it exists for the base code, which may or may not be similar to the stretch code amendment process. Again, as Jeanette and Allison said, we'll find out more about the stretch code process possibly today at 1 p.m. So last August for the base code, the Capital Development Board put out a public call for amendments to the 2021 ICC for the state energy code. After the deadline for amendments passed, the Illinois Energy Code Advisory Council began meeting to hear from proponents of those amendments. The amendment is usually discussed in those meetings. The council votes on the amendments and they've been voting in a series of public meetings this fall. The amendments that pass a simple majority vote by the Illinois Energy Code Advisory Council will then be submitted for consideration to the Capital Development Board. After the state will undergo a rulemaking process, which usually allows for public comment on the proposed code. NBI and the Metropolitan Mayor's Caucus, we've proposed several of the amendments that I'm going to be talking about today for inclusion in Illinois' base code. As Allison mentioned during the meetings, the makeup of that board, because they're mostly builder representatives who are concerned about first costs and not the long-term impact of their decisions. They're worried about those amendments increasing first costs, so they're saying that they should not be in the state base code, but instead be in the potential stretch code. Again, we don't know if this process will be similar when the state develops a stretch code, though we have heard that the sitting members on the Illinois Energy Advisory Council will remain and new members will be added, as Allison mentioned, because of CEJA. We also know that the state is required to adopt a stretch code that municipalities can adopt by December 31st, 2023. Next slide, please. So today I'd like to get your input on potential requirements for the state stretch code that support the 5 foundations I discussed earlier and CEJA's goals for the state. These requirements are being considered for adoption in the national codes and have already been adopted by many cities and states across the country who are interested in protecting the public health, saving their residents money, and reducing their state's impact on climate change. They cover 4 of the 5 foundations: renewables, EV-ready infrastructure, reducing barriers or requiring building electrification, and getting Illinois buildings ready to begin using grid integration techniques like demand response and energy storage. In this presentation, I'm going to first describe the potential code requirement, and then ask for your feedback on whether you think it should be required in your community and whether this requirement would impact your interest in adopting the state stretch code. We can then use your responses to determine which requirements to propose to the stretch code committee, if that's part of the process, and also demonstrate to the stretch code committee the level of community support for those requirements. Next slide, please. Thanks. Okay, So let's start talking about potential amendments we could propose to the Capital Development Board to strengthen the state stretch code. Let's first talk about on-site solar. Because of CEJA, solar, which is already very cheap, will be even cheaper to install in Illinois. For residential buildings, we recommend a requirement to make homes solar ready so that homes have the infrastructure in place, so they don't have to undergo expensive retrofits to install solar at a later date. Making a home solar ready at the time of construction costs around $200 per home, but retrofitting that home later, if it's not solar ready, can cost up to $4,000. On the commercial side, we recommend a requirement for solar energy. This language has already been adopted by ASHRAE 90.1 Commercial Energy Code for inclusion in the next version of the commercial code in ASHRAE 90.1 2022. It would require commercial buildings to install 0.25 watts of solar per square foot multiplied by the gross area of the largest 3 floors of the commercial building. This requirement is for a nominal amount of solar, powering around 4 to 5% of the building's energy use. It is an extremely cost-effective way to reduce future retrofit costs if a commercial building wants to add to that solar array at a later date. Also, solar is really cheap right now for commercial buildings. According to DOE, the levelized cost of energy for solar on commercial buildings is around 5 to 6 cents per kilowatt hour. Of course, as you know, these amendments would not only reduce barriers to on-site solar in buildings, but it will also reduce carbon emissions, improve air quality, add good jobs to the state, and help communities become more resilient to the extreme weather events if the solar is paired with an energy storage system. Next slide, please. So here's what the proposed code language would look like. It's in underlined form because these are new requirements. Next slide, please. And here are the questions that I would love for you guys to answer. I want to know if you think residential construction should be solar ready. And I want to know if you think commercial construction should be required to have a nominal amount of solar, of course, with reasonable exceptions for buildings that have too much shading. And then finally, I'd love to know that if this requirement were in the state stretch code, but not in the state base code, if it would make you more likely to adopt the stretch code or less likely to adopt the stretch code. We'll give them a few more seconds. It looks like we're getting lots of good responses.
And remember, if you're not seeing that poll window, to click on the polls button at the bottom of your screen.
Right. And also scroll down to the last question as well.
Right, there are 3 questions. So.
Great. 31 question answers. Thank you guys so much for providing this feedback. All right. I think we've got enough. Edith, do you want to close the poll and share the results? Okay, great. So as you can see, it looks like a lot of people are interested in requiring residential buildings to be solar ready. I think that makes a lot of sense. It's a really cheap to do that at the time of construction, but expensive to do it as a retrofit. A lot of people are also interested in requiring commercial to have a little bit of solar on them. A few people were a little more hesitant and a few were unsure. And then scrolling down, it looks like people are either more likely to adopt a straight state stretch code or neutral, with one person less likely to adopt and a few unsure. All right, thank you guys so much for providing this feedback. As I said, I'm gonna take this feedback and we'll be involved in the state stretch code process and we'll be able to share it with the individuals making these decisions. All right, next slide, please. Okay, moving on to electric vehicles. The transportation sector in Illinois is responsible for emitting 33% of the state's total greenhouse gas emissions. Electrifying the transportation sector as the state transitions to more renewable energy is crucial to reducing those emissions, which is why CEJA is also incentivizing that transition. To further the goals of CEJA, we recommend Illinois require new residential buildings to be EV ready. That means that they have one EV ready space that has an outlet or junction box that will allow the home to be easily add an EV charger at a later date. We estimate that this costs a builder roughly $114 to make a new home EV ready, and retrofit costs can be exorbitant, ranging from $400 to $1,700 if this requirement is not in place. We also recommend for commercial buildings that a certain number of parking spaces have charging equipment, a certain number be EV ready, and a certain number be EV capable, which is very similar to EV ready. We recommend those requirements vary by building type. For example, apartment buildings should have different requirements than office buildings. EV ready requirements are important because they reduce barriers to EVs in the state. Only 2% of commercial buildings today have EV chargers, which is a problem if CEJA is successful in its goal of transitioning 1 out of 5 cars in Illinois to be electric in 10 short years. This requirement also reduces future retrofit costs, which can become really expensive in commercial buildings. You need to retrench a parking lot to install conduit and wire underneath to hook up that EV charger to electricity. An EV ready space for new construction is estimated, for commercial buildings, is estimated to cost around $1,000. But a retrofit after construction costs the building owners 3 to 4 times that amount. And if you guys were involved in the national code adoption process, EV ready requirements were included in the, were voted for inclusion in the 2021 IECC, but the board repealed that decision because they felt it was out of scope. Since then, they changed their minds and now it's back in scope, which is interesting. Next slide, please. Thank you, Jeanette. And here are recommendations for the percentage of spaces that have EV equipment or EV ready or EV capable. Group B occupancies cover retail, Group M occupancies are office buildings, and R2 occupancies are multifamily buildings. Next slide, please.
Just a quick, there's a question from Timothy for EV charging. Should EV chargers need to be able to communicate with the grid for V to X time of use, peak energy use reduction, building energy management as a way to reduce and optimize energy and therefore gain benefits?
Yes, and we include automatic ALMS, automatic load management system, in our EV ready and EV charging language, so that it can communicate with each other to reduce the load on the building panel. As for communicating with the grid, that's a little bit harder. I think ideally in the long term, our EV cars can, those batteries in our EV cars can be service storage for the grid. I think current car manufacturers are, some car manufacturers allow it, some car manufacturers don't. So it's a little more of an emerging technology, but yes, I think that's eventually that's where we're going to go as a country. All right, next slide, please, Jeanette. And yeah, thank you for
Manning the slides,
yeah,
manning the questions.
manning the questions. Exactly.
Womaning the questions, I guess.
Thank you. All right, so here are questions about electric vehicles. Again, I want to hear from you. Do you think residential construction should be required to be EV ready? Do you think commercial construction should have, some spaces should have charging equipment and some spaces should be EV ready or EV capable? And finally, if those requirements were in the stretch code, would it affect whether you adopted it?
I'm a little bit troubled that we're having this conversation about a code that's not going to happen for several years. We're talking in Highland Park about adding an EV ready requirement, hopefully next year, so 2022. And to me, that's already a bit late. We are also wiring and have been wiring parking lots with the conduit to make them EV ready when we've redone parking lots over the last year. to think that anybody would say that we shouldn't be requiring EV ready in 2024 is horrifying to me. I mean, are we even going to be able to buy internal combustion cars at that point?
Right. So this is a great point, and I've been trying to respond to your question, Kim, in the chat, and I don't want to take up too much time on here, but I just want to let you all know that as municipalities, you cannot require beyond the state code efficiency requirements that are stronger than the state code, but you can do all of the other things. You can require solar, you can require EV charging, you can do those things. All of that this is going to do by 2024, depending on what is depending on what the timeline is and what ends up in the stretch code, is that it's going to make it a consistent code that everybody would have and could adopt. But the most important part of it is that the stretch code finally allows municipalities to adopt a consistent one that goes beyond in terms of the energy efficiency of the buildings itself. So I don't want you to think and rightly be terrified that you're not allowed to do some of these other things that you're talking about doing, because you can, but you currently cannot go beyond in terms of the energy conservation requirements. So hopefully that helps clear things up.
Thanks, Allison. And I concur. I think the climate change is a rather urgent crisis, and emissions avoided today are way more important than emissions avoided in 5-10 years. So and it is frustrating that this can't be a stretch code until the end of 2023 or beginning of 2024. All right.
Can I just add one more level of nuance here? Because yeah, there's everything that Diana and Allison said. There's also existing programs, utility funded programs that do support buildings to construct their buildings beyond code right now. Like the common new construction program does incentivize buildings to build beyond current code. Now that's not necessarily saying it's not a one-to-one to the stretch code that we're proposing, but it's just good to note that there are mechanisms to reduce the first costs that you could encourage within your building community and your new construction community, your new construction market within your community, that those are existing programs right now that you could take advantage of. So just wanted to mention that. It's just not mandatory.
And Edith, you can share, I'm sharing the results now. Thank you. So it looks like the vast majority of people either are unsure or think, yes, new residential construction should be required to be EV ready. The same for commercial, although one person thought maybe not. And then most people either neutral or more likely to adopt if it was a requirement in the state stretch code. And also to mention the building and the infrastructure bill that the federal government just passed has a lot of EV charging incentives and funding, so that'll be good. All right, so moving on, let's talk about building electrification. Sorry. So in 2016, combustion equipment in commercial and residential buildings accounted for 17% of Illinois' greenhouse gas emissions. Since Illinois is quickly moving to power its electricity off of renewable energy, we need to start transitioning Illinois to power its buildings with that renewable energy instead of fossil fuels like natural gas. Making the switch also has the added benefit of improving indoor air quality inside buildings and outside. We recommend a stretch code that either requires new buildings to be all electric or make sure buildings are built with the electrical infrastructure in place so they can easily become all electric in the future. All electric buildings tend to be less expensive to build than buildings with natural gas because you don't have to install the natural gas infrastructure in the building. And if you install efficient heat pumps, they also cost less to operate. But if an all-electric requirement is too big of a leap for Illinois builders, many states and cities are considering electric ready requirements in their code. And this was Another one of the requirements that was voted into the 2021 ICC, but then removed by the board of the ICC because they thought it was out of scope. Again, like EV Ready, they are now saying it is in scope of the energy code. We estimate the cost of adding this infrastructure at the time of construction for residential buildings to be around $440 to be electric ready, but later as a retrofit cost can exceed $6,000 if the panel needs to be upgraded for a higher capacity. For commercial buildings, cost to run the infrastructure at the time of construction is around 25 cents per square foot, but if installed as a retrofit, cost again can be exorbitant. So go to the next slide, please. Here's an example of electric ready language for water heating, which allows a homeowner to easily switch from a water heater that runs on fossil fuels to a super efficient heat pump water heater that runs on electricity. Next slide, please. And again, I would love to get your feedback on what you think should be in the state stretch code for Illinois. Do you think residential construction should be required to be all electric or electric ready or have no requirement? Or are you unsure? Same for commercial. And then I would love to know if all electric requirements were in the stretch code and not in the base code. How would that affect your interest in adopting the stretch code? And same for electric ready. It looks like lots of people are responding. Thank you guys so much. Great, we'll wait a few more seconds, but looks like we're getting lots of good responses. So again, thank you.
Let's close it so that we can keep moving on.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
Thanks, Jeanette. So it looks like about a third of people want to be a little more aggressive in residential construction and require residential buildings to be all electric. 2/3 think electric ready is a good in between, and then one person thought no requirement was important. And then on commercial construction, a few more people thought it should be all electric, and still the majority thought electric ready was a more appropriate requirement. And then it looks like if all electric requirements were in the stretch code, more people would be neutral, but some would be more likely to adopt. And then if electric ready requirements, it looks like slightly more people would be more likely to adopt. All right, thank you so much. All right, moving on to demand response. And there are only 2 more polls, demand response and energy storage. So again, thank you for all of your input. So if Illinois were to electrify their buildings and have them run off renewables, then we need to start thinking about better integrating our buildings with the grid. So Illinois utilities don't have to turn on natural gas plants to meet demand during those times of the day when the wind isn't blowing or the sun isn't shining. We recommend that code requires demand responsive thermostats and water heaters to be installed in residential and commercial buildings. These requirements would have the added benefit of ensuring building owners can take advantage of utility incentives to reduce demand during certain times of the day through new potential time use programs. Next slide, please. And here's our poll. Do you think residential commercial construction should be required to install demand responsive water heaters and thermostats? And as Jeanette said, we're gonna maybe close this a little bit earlier because we're running out of time. So respond quickly. Great. One more second, and then I'm going to ask Edith to close the poll. Edith, can you close the poll? Thank you. So it looks like the majority of people do think that residential construction should be required to install demand responsive water heaters, and the same for commercial, though a few not think that should be a requirement. And then a few people thought they would be more likely to adopt, and a few people would be neutral. All right, let's move on to energy storage. All right, so the final requirement we recommend is making buildings energy storage ready, which basically means reserving a space on the electrical panel and space in the building for batteries. As you can guess, energy storage with solar not only helps with grid integration, but also increases the resilience of a community by allowing buildings to keep the lights on when the utility grid is down. Energy storage, like demand response, can also reduce utility costs through time of use rates. California, which is already at 33% renewable today, has time of use rates because of these grid integration problems, and customers are now finding it makes more financial sense in California to install solar and storage than just solar. Next slide, please. So the same questions, do you think residential construction should be energy storage ready, or should commercial be energy storage ready? And if this were a requirement in state stretch code, would this affect your interest? Great, and again, we'll try and close this poll quickly because we need to move on, but thank you so much for all your feedback. I really appreciate it. And hopefully we can introduce and get some of these amendments into the state stretch code that you guys think should be there. All right, we'll give it a few more seconds. All right, Edith, I think we can share the results. All right, so it looks like majority do think that buildings should be energy storage ready, though if you didn't think that should be a requirement. And then either people would be more likely to adopt or neutral if it were a requirement. All right, thank you so much. And I will pass it on to Jeanette to touch on building performance standards and that big problem of existing buildings.
Thanks, Diana. That was really good. It was really fun to see everybody's feedback on all of those pieces of potentially the base code or the stretch code. It's great. So as we mentioned before, we're talking about these policies. Stretch codes and reach codes are really focusing on new construction. I realize probably this slide would have been better served maybe had I shown this a little earlier, but building performance standards is a policy mechanism that is entirely focused on existing buildings. I want to recognize that we only have less than 15 minutes left, so we're not going to spend a whole lot of time here, just because there's so much information that we could talk about. But I know that the interest is there, so we could talk about how we might want to address this maybe in a later conversation. But basically what ends up happening for building performance standards, I have about 2 slides on this before I talk about kind of program related topics and getting your feedback. But basically, in order to do a building performance standard, you need to start with benchmarking of the buildings, because what ends up happening is the building performance standard says for a certain subset of buildings that are the worst performers, over a period of time, those buildings have to improve their performance. That's what the policy is essentially mandating. In order to start that, you need to know which of your buildings are those worst performers. You need to benchmark those buildings, and benchmarking could be using an existing tool like a building portfolio manager through the EPA. But it's essentially a tool that allows building owners to track their energy over time. It does motivate performance improvement. We've seen that. There is generally a savings per year that over time, people that track their energy tend to reduce their energy use because they know what they're doing. Building performance standards are that mechanism that folks are talking about in the chat that addresses that large number of buildings that are existing, that are old, that may not have had much attention to them. And this is a policy that that can be put in place to address those underperforming buildings. And now Diana, the NBI, this is, I'm sharing NBI's slide. So thank you, Diana, for letting me use this. This is something we presented, I believe, back in March, but it really talks about the framework for building performance standards. You know, part of it is that there has to be, because it affects so many buildings, there has to be a stakeholder process. It has to have engagement of the building community, of any property managers and owners that this would affect. And then, you know, in terms of policy making and implementation, it's one thing to say you must reduce your energy over a period of time, but then this establishing tools and resources is key to making sure that it's a palatable policy, that people don't have a lot of pushback, that it's just, you know, a mandate that says, oh, you just have to, you're on your own to reduce your energy consumption. This framework really highlights the fact that as municipalities, you can help provide, you know, the tools and resources. And we could talk, that actually is a great segue into the next slide. I don't want to spend a lot of time on this right now, but you know, we will actually talk about it in a little bit in terms of the tools and resources that you think you need. But in the chat, if you're, you know, if we want to, you know, I'm curious to hear if folks are really interested in building performance standards, and we can consider how to communicate kind of next steps through the mayor's caucus at a future date, you know, specific to this policy. But for now, I'm going to step back again and talk about kind of the programs that support building policies. You know, there are utility programs. I think you know, I'm not going to go through them, and there are a number of different utilities that are serving each of your municipalities. But in Illinois, there's a lot of utility programs that address everything from, you know, existing buildings to new construction, residential, commercial, and industrial, and also electric energy and natural gas. Utilities do have a statutory requirement to spend a certain amount on energy efficiency investments for their customers and meet energy savings goals. You know, I did want to mention here that no programs currently exist in Illinois for advancing or supporting codes like stretch codes that were just talked about. But we are, as Allison mentioned earlier, talking about how those programs might be developed to really support everything that we're talking about. Because even though we know that there are a lot of energy savings, we also recognize that there is a little bit of market transformation that needs to happen. And it's at some point there's a potentially higher initial costs that need to be allayed, we need to recognize that there might be a learning curve. And we want to address that through programs to kind of move the market. That's what the utility programs are oftentimes tasked to do. Now, some might ask, you know, what is the benefit to the municipality? What are the, you know, in terms of utility support, what is the benefit to the utility? Really, the benefits to the municipality are that you have the capabilities of offering tools, resources, programs to your residents so that they can take advantage of incentives or educational opportunities. On the utility side, it helps them, you know, like I mentioned, meet their synergy savings and spending goals. And they do tend to want to increase positive customer interactions. So, you know, that is one level of benefit to them. There are a few ways that utility programs can touch municipalities. And we broke it down by kind of the target market that we see here. So one, as was mentioned earlier in the chat and in conversation, was building code officials. These are a few program ideas. We're going to talk a few more in detail. Actually, we don't have a lot of time to talk in much detail, but our slides do talk through these in a little more detail. But compliance guidance, understanding what is needed for them to enforce and comply with the code or updated codes, targeted training and education to make sure everyone's up to date. A circuit rider is basically somebody that is available, is on call to help review plans or to kind of troubleshoot from a building code official's perspective. And then this energy code compliance collaborative is something that Mia has been pushing, that essentially pools all the resources and people working to work together to kind of advance these policies. For the design and construction community, it's very similar to the building code officials, but they're actually constructing, they're designing the building. So they might need different technical guidance in order to create buildings that are meeting the stretch code. Similarly, they might want to go through training and education. They might want incentives for meeting design requirements. Sometimes money is a motivator for making sure that they can meet the codes. And then finally, and then the Energy Code Compliance Collaborative is similar, similarly encompass everybody. The jurisdiction policymaking target market is really talking about advancing the code. Is what do you need as a municipal leader to advance any of these codes that we're talking about? Kim from Highland Park mentioned that the timeline is, it needs to be kind of fast and so what kind of tools do policymakers need to make sure that it's adopted? Not maybe everybody on this call, we could see from the polls that Diana, not everybody agrees on what should be happening. So those are the kind of things that we want to make sure that you have the tools to push things forward. I kind of went through all of these and I'm looking at the time. So I'm just this goes through it in more detail. I want to honor everybody's time knowing that we've already spent an hour and a half together. I think these slides are self-explanatory and they will be available after the call. I did go through them pretty quickly in my overview slide. So we have 3 questions to end this. They're all lumped together. Perfect. Okay. So the first question is, what type of support programs are of most interest to you based on these target markets? And they could be all of them, could be none. And then the next question is, what aspects of programs provide the most value to you and your constituents? And those kind of run down the laundry list of the program options that we talked about. And if there's anything that is not listed here, feel free to answer in the chat because we are interested to hear from you about all of this. And then actually the third question, it's a little separate than the first 2 questions. I think they're lumped together here. But we were just curious to finalize, our final question, but basically, how would you rate your level of interest in your jurisdiction to adopt the Illinois stretch code, pending availability? So thank you for quickly answering it. We're getting a lot of good feedback. We'll give it a couple seconds more. And I know there's some chat that's happening. I'm not sure I'm going to be able to address this entirely right now, but we can close this slide and share. So it looks like it's somewhat even split, but a little bit more towards the programs that support building code officials and help municipalities advance policy. This could be related to the people on the call, because I imagine there's less people from the design and construction community on the call. But that's good to note. What aspects provide most value to you? The technical assistance and the targeted training and to a lesser extent, incentives and assistance from utilities to advance policy are kind of the top four, with technical assistance and guidance clearly being the key area that you are most interested in. And then finally, how would you rate your level of interest in your jurisdiction to adopt the stretch code? I think we have a few people that just said we're going to adopt it no matter what, and then more people with a little more nuanced view. We will likely adopt it, but have some reservations, and there's some level of interest, but the priority is low. Luckily, it looks like nobody responded that this policy is not at all politically feasible. Although a few people said they're not sure right now. So we appreciate all of that feedback that is incredibly useful for us to hear. And we didn't have that much time for additional feedback, but here is our conversation, or sorry, here's our conversation. Here's our emails to have additional conversations. And we look forward to having those with you. And really thank you for the Mayor's Caucus for the opportunity to present on this. And really appreciate everyone's great feedback. Edith or Mayor Burns, is there anything that you want to close out? Or I should say Allison or Diana, is there anything that you want to say in terms of a final?
Just the one thing I'll say, in case you weren't following the chat, is we're getting a lot of requests for BPS. And so if it's okay with the Metropolitan Mayor's Caucus, we'd like to explore that option for having a further conversation about that, about benchmarking BPS and then potentially even other policies that could help with existing buildings. And so, yeah, that's the only thing that I'll say, but agreed. Thank you so much for having us here today. And also thank you for the work that you all are doing. You're making a huge difference.
If I can just add, first of all, happy to schedule another environment committee meeting. And this isn't as good as having a dialogue, but it's great to see so much participation, and the poll questions are very helpful. So this dialogue is really informative, and we can be responsive and schedule another meeting specifically to dig into building performance standards. Is there anyone who feels like their question was not answered in the chat? It seems like we had a pretty good dialogue there, but I think most everything has been addressed that was raised. If not, please raise your hand. If I could, before we let everyone go, for those building officials that have not yet identified, if you would just type in the chat that you are indeed representing the building expertise in your village, that would be helpful for us just to know who's on the call. And with that, I think I can turn it over to Kevin for a closeout and a reminder of what's up for the next meeting. And if he has stepped away, which I think it was, let me just express deep appreciation. We are so grateful to Jeanette, Allison, and Diana. They've kind of adopted us for an opportunity to learn about our role in building policies, and it's really been critical as we are moving forward with a climate action plan, and then we look forward to these new programs as they're evolving. So we are so grateful for their ongoing participation, and we meet a lot between these environment committee meetings. So thank you, Allison, Jeanette, and Diana for being our friends and helping us along. We will continue to get feedback from all of you as is helpful. There are opportunities to continue engagement, and we will individually reach out if you have agreed to be considered for one of these advisory council roles, or if there are other opportunities. Some of you were with us when we were advocating for codes at the national level. So please watch for emails from myself or Kevin or Cheryl about specific opportunities to advocate, and make sure that we have contact with the right folks in your communities as well, so we can get this information to them to really encourage the municipal voice. If we've learned one thing in all this process, it's that we have a really strong role in driving these policies, and we need to have a voice at the table and make sure that we're, our expertise and resources are considered as they move forward. And so next meeting, we are meeting in December. Some of you may want the month off, but it's busy. We've got a climate emergency here and there's much to do. We will be pivoting a little bit and we'll have our first conversation really looking at the transportation sector, which we have not done much. So thank you for Metropolitan Planning Council really for helping us activate on transportation. And we are going to participate with staff from RTA and MPC to talk about how that regional transportation, regional transit investment planning that they're engaged in now, and what we can learn from it and what input we might have in that. So watch for that invitation. And again, thank you so much for joining us, everyone.